Guys. So there are many textual variances within the New Testament that a lot of people seem to kind of favor one and not the other. So today, what we're going to look at the textual variant that is brought up in First Corinthians chapter 10 here, verse 9. Now, the main textual variant of First Corinthians 10:9 concerns whether the original Greek text reads Christ or Christos or the Lord, Kyrion, with some also suggesting God or Theon. Now, while early papyri like P46 support Christ, later major manuscripts often favor the Lord, leading to different translations, with Christ that read like KJV, New King James, and the ESV, and the Lord, the NIV, the NSAB, the NAT, being common in those. Now, this variation affects theological interpretation, with some seeing Christ as affirming Christ's deity by equating him with the God of the Old Testament, while others argue contextually the Lord, referring to the God of Israel, fits better. Now, here's kind of the core issue. So, guys, we have these three things here. So, Christ here is found in some earlier manuscripts, like I said earlier, in P46, and the majority of the Byzantine text. Now, Kurios, or the Lord, which could also refer to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, which is God, is found significantly early in Alexandrian manuscripts and the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and the modern critical texts. And then God, Theos, also appears, but it's a less common variant, but it does appear in some small texts. Now, the theological significances of these are: when you read Christ, it implies that the Israelites in the wilderness were tempted Jesus, Christ, directly, strongly affirming his divinity and the pre-existence. Now, reading the Lord or God connects the temptation to Yahweh, God, in the Old Testament, which also is significant, but uses a different terminology. Now, again, the manuscript evidence that we have weighs in early on the P46 reading that reads Christ, but a lot of the manuscripts that came after read the Lord. Now, with the Christology reading of this, it strongly implies that Jesus is pre-incarnate existence and deity, equating tempting of him with tempting of God in the Old Testament, specifically in Numbers chapter 21. Now, the context surrounding this verse in 1 Corinthians 10 talks about Israel's wilderness experience, aka with the manna, the rock, the idolatry, and the snakes, as spiritual lessons or types with antitypes for Christians, that Paul was then linking these together as a spiritual food and the rock. Now, the scholars debate about some that argue the Lord, referring to Yahweh, is the more original, with Christ was added later to emphasize the Trinitarian understanding, while others see Christ as the intentional to show the identity of the Old Testament Lord with Jesus. Now, the text in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 9, there's some references that we see within the Torah. So the first one we're going to look at is Exodus chapter 17, verse 2, and it's which says, "Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.' And Moses said to them, 'Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?'" So there we see the testing of the Lord right there. And then in verse 7, it says, "And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they had tested the Lord by saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?'" All right. We also see this in Numbers 21, 5 through 6, which says, "And the people spoke against God and Moses. 'Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food.' Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and then they bit the people, and that many of the people in Israel died." And then also Deuteronomy 6:16, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test, as you tested him at Massah." So as we can see from these examples that are brought up within the Torah, Numbers is more referring to the latter of verse 9, when Exodus and Deuteronomy here are referring to the beginning part of verse 9. Basically, the main part of testing the Lord. But as we can see from these examples, everything here is bring up with Lord. So if Paul had the Torah, and if he was a student of the Torah, which he was, all right, it was more probable for him to use Christ there, or excuse me, for him to use Lord there and instead of Christ, just because as we see from the examples of Exodus and Deuteronomy, he uses the term Lord, not Christ. Even in the Hebrew, it'd be Messiah, Mashiach, which again he's not using. This Lord here is more of the reference to Yud He Vav He. Now, even the Psalms bring up the same reference here. So here in Psalm 78:18 and verse 56, it says, they tested God in their heart by demanding the food they crave. So here they use God, and then they tested and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies. Psalms 95:9, when your fathers put me to the test, obviously God here is speaking, put me to the proof, though they had not seen my work. And then Psalms 106:14, but they had a went on craving in the wilderness and put God to the test in the desert. So in Psalms over here, the majority of the understanding of who is this is actually God, not necessarily referring to Lord or Christ, but more of God. That is also a very strong reason of why we do have some smaller manuscripts also rendering 1 Corinthians 10:9 as God, because of the texts and references that Psalms brings up. But so far, any of the references that we have in the Old Testament, none of them refer to any type of Messiah or Christ, any Mashiach or Christos that we see at all. And again, if Paul was a renowned scholar that he is, he studied under Gamaliel, who was the grandson of Hillel, one of the greatest rabbis of all time. He was a Pharisee among Pharisees, right? He knew this stuff. So if he's going to be quoting something as in a reference to it, he's going to obviously use either Lord, as we've seen through the Torah, or we're going to see God right here. But with the majority of the text saying Lord, that we can tell by the context that it's referring to Lord or God right here. Now, this is a commentary from the REV Bible that I'm going to just read for you guys. I feel like this gives a very honest, detailed approach. So here it is. Now, this verse and its context make it clear that it is not at all wise to test the Lord. People regularly ignore God's commands as they do free to do, for this is man's day. 1 Corinthians 4:3. But there is a day coming when God will hold people accountable, and we will all want to be found righteous on that day. Although the verb tempt is present subjunctive, it has the intensifier ek as a prefix, and thus the translation must is considered appropriate. Now, many translations read Christ instead of Lord and use this verse as a support of the Trinity. Some Greek manuscripts read Lord, some read God, and some read Christ. Furthermore, the church fathers are divided as well because different fathers quoted the verse differently, clearly because they were reading manuscripts that differed from one another. The subject of textual criticism is very involved, and it is common that scholars differ in their opinions as to which texts are original and which text has been altered. In this case, there are early texts that read both ways, so the job of determining the original reading from textual evidence becomes more difficult. Although there are a wide variety of manuscripts, even old ones that read Christ, as Bar Ehrman points out, quote, these arguments, however, are not persuasive. In fact, we know that most Christians had no difficulty at all in understanding how Christ could have been active in the affairs of the ancient Israelites. Most of them believed he was actively involved and read his involvement into the Old Testament narratives on every possible occasion. Now, that is from A right there. The footnote for that citation is at the end of the slides. Now, Ehrman goes on to point out why the text would have been changed to read Christ and shows that the Alexandrian text is usually considered more accurate, and the Alexandrian text, or Sinaiticus 33 BC, read Lord. Now, we agree with Ehrman's conclusions and the authors of the English versions that read Lord and believe Lord was the original reading. As it is translated in versions that take the word Lord as original, there is no Trinitarian interference or support. Now, there is only a Trinitarian inference if the manuscripts that read Christ are considered original. Now, every translator will testify to the importance of context in determining the correct translation of Scripture. The context makes it clear that Lord is the correct reading, although there are many other times that the Israelites were said to tempt God or Yahweh, often translated as the Lord. In the Old Testament, there is not even a single reference to tempting Christ. Furthermore, there is not even a reference to tempting Adoni, the generic word for Lord. The Israelites tempted their God Yahweh, never Christ. Now, by reading 1 Corinthians 10:9 carefully, we obtain a vital clue to the meaning and the proper translation. The verse says that when the Israelites tempted the Lord, they were destroyed by serpents. Now, this phrase also allows us to find the exact record in the Old Testament that is being referenced to. In Numbers 21:5, the Israelites spoke against God, and then Yahweh sent venomous snakes among them. Numbers 21:6. Now, in the record of this event in the Old Testament, God and Yahweh are both mentioned, but Christ is never mentioned, and neither is the generic Hebrew word for Lord. Furthermore, there is no scripture anywhere in the Old Testament that says Christ poured out his wrath, and certainly not by sending serpents. Thus, if some Greek texts read the Lord and others read Christ, the context points to Lord as the correct interpretation. Now, there are some commentators, however, who assert that the context mentions Christ because 1 Corinthians 10:4 says that the Israelites drank of the rock and the rock was Christ. Now, we would first point this out as we have in the commentary that actually 1 Corinthians 10:4 militates against the reading Christ and 1 Corinthians 10:9, because 1 Corinthians 10:4 says that Christ was coming in the future, which in which case he could not have been tempted by the Israelites. And then they have a commentary on 1 Corinthians 10:4 on that. Now, in fact, we said that Christ followed the Israelites by 1400 years. When the prophet Balaam said the Messiah was coming in the future, Numbers 24:17, no one protested and said he was with them at that very time. In fact, all the Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah coming in the future were never contested or clarified as if they meant only that he would come in the flesh in the future, but was with them at the time as a spirit. And there's our second footnote B right there. Now, guys, real quick, you can take a screenshot, anything you want. These were the two quotations that the REV Bible commentary used regarding this. So now, just to clarify real quick, 1 Corinthians 10:9, it is a textual variant. To all the Trinitarians, whoever's reading this Bible, you need to just be honest. There are different renderings for Christ, Lord, and God. God being the less likely one, and the majority we have of Christ and Lord. So we can probably push away God for a second. But when we go back to the Torah, it makes no reference to Christ. It makes no reference to God, only the Lord. When we see the references in Psalms, as we pointed out, it points references to God, who is the Lord, not Christ. Christ became Christ, was anointed by God or by the Lord. So there is a distinction that is being used there, as God is being referenced to the Father and Lord is also being referenced to the Father. So again, the most accurate rendering or reading of this would be Lord. But that's just the evidence that we see from there. It is still a textual variant. So just wanted to make everyone aware of that. So hopefully now your understanding of 1 Corinthians 10:9 makes a lot more sense. And thank you for joining me. And stay tuned for more episodes as we go over more textual variances within the New Testament. Shalom.